You were never supposed to know this. Not because it was forgotten, because it was sealed, deliberately, repeatedly, by men in robes and offices, who whispered prayers over the bones they purchased, bones they never asked questions about, because if they had, they would have found the Whitmores, and they would have found us. They say the saints of old brought miracles to the American colonies. That sacred relics, small bone fragments wrapped in velvet, hearts preserved in salt and sealed in gold, protected the faithful from plague, fire, and madness. But no one asks where those relics came from. Not really. 17 congregations across Pennsylvania, dozens of holy artifacts, over 73 disappearances, and a family name purged from every church ledger, every town record, every obituary. Whitmore. The moment you speak that name in certain towns west of Philadelphia, you can feel it. A tightening in the room, a flicker of suspicion behind the eyes. They know. But they'll never say it, because for nearly 50 years, the Whitmores were the church's most powerful secret. Artisans, yes. Butchers, more accurately, converting flesh to faith, blood to belief, death to doctrine. This isn't just a horror story. This is your spiritual inheritance. You grew up in churches, built by men who prayed over body parts. You sat in pews where hollow wood pulsed with something too warm, too sacred, too recent. You were told those relics were from Europe, from Rome, from saints long gone. That was the lie. The truth is buried in pine boxes, under floorboards, behind sealed stone walls, sanctified by silence. And that silence ends now. Because in the hills of Chester County, one manuscript survived, hidden behind plaster. Its author, long dead, his guilt soaked into the parchment. His name was Thomas Whitmore, and what he confessed will never let you sleep again. This is the story they tried to erase from history, but like all forbid, den knowledge it waited, and now it's yours. If you're still watching, you're not here by accident. You're part of something ancient, something awakening. And you won't be the same by the end of this video. They made sure of that. Chester County wasn't chosen by chance. It was the perfect mask, rolling hills, dense woods, and just far enough from Philadelphia that no one asked too many questions. A land where ministers preached one thing by daylight and paid for something else entirely under cover of fog. In 1742, the Whitmores arrived from England, a family of 6, quiet, diligent, respected. Nathaniel Whitmore claimed to be a craftsman of religious items, chalices, communion plates, ornate Bible covers, and his work was good, too good, so good that church leaders began traveling miles just to commission him. But that's not what they came for. They came for power, real power, not the kind printed in Scripture, the kind you can touch, the kind you can hide inside an altar box, the kind that drips red long after the service ends. The Whitmore workshop stood on 12 acres of pine-wrapped property, 2 stories of timber and silence, windows wide enough to let light in, thick doors strong enough to keep screams in. By 1745, Nathaniel had 2 apprentices, both orphans, both eager, and both completely unaware of what waited beneath their feet. A hidden cellar, cold stone floors, racks, hooks, tables stained with devotion. His wife, Elizabeth, never blinked. She handled the accounts, the guests, the bodies. Neighbors called her graceful, others called her unnatural, but all agreed. She was unshakable. Their children helped where they could. Thomas, the eldest, carried wood, boiled water, learned the trade. The daughters did the stitching, the bookkeeping, the letters to churches requesting donations. The youngest, William, was different, strange. He wandered the woods for hours, collecting bones and plants, preserving dead birds in jars, and always watching. You've heard of families that serve God. This one fed on him, and what they offered churches was more than craftsmanship. It was sacrifice, but it had to start somewhere, with someone, and on one froze. November 17th, 1745. The storm was already coming down, heavy wind, black sky, snow just beginning to whisper along the branches. Mary Collins didn't hesitate. She heard Nathaniel's voice calling from the woods, said his son had gone missing, said the boy wandered too far past dusk, said he needed help. She followed. She always helped. Mary had spent her life serving the sick, praying with the dying. She believed in mercy, and that belief led her into the clearing behind the Whitmore workshop, where the trees closed in and the sky vanished. Thomas Whitmore wrote what happened next. He was 16. He watched from the upstairs window. He said the floor of the back room had been covered in canvas. He said his mother had laid out instruments wrapped in linen. He said, "I thought we were making representations, icons, sacred images. I didn't understand until the screaming started." They didn't kill Mary quickly. It wasn't about death. It was about preparation. Her body was drained, cleaned, divided, preserved. 3 days later, Nathaniel rode into Philadelphia with 6 wooden boxes, each one beautifully carved, each one containing something divine, a piece of her rib, her hand, her heart, her teeth. Elizabeth sewed pouches from black velvet, lined with gold thread, filled them with preserved pieces, labeled them with false saints' names, and sealed them with wax. At their next church service, Nathaniel cried when he spoke of Mary's passing. He donated a handcrafted altar box in her memory, said it was her final gift, said she would live on in the congregation. No one knew, no one asked. They just nodded and prayed and wept. But inside that altar box, hidden beneath the false bottom, was a sliver of Mary's spine, wrapped in linen, soaked in cedar oil, offered to God, but paid for by men, and it worked. Within weeks, that congregation reported strange healings. A child's fever vanished overnight. A man with a crushed foot wall. Power always expands. And once the Whitmores saw how easily one congregation could be bought, they realized something far darker. They didn't need to find customers. The customers would find them. By 1750, Nathaniel's network stretched across Pennsylvania. Ministers, rectors, elders, all men of God, all desperate for spiritual authority they could hold in their hands. He told them the relics came from Europe, from Rome, from secret Catholic sources that couldn't be revealed. He whispered that these objects were ancient, holy, proven, and they believed him, because belief is easier than truth, because truth requires consequence. What they didn't know was that every relic was made in that cellar, made from people no one would miss: the poor, the wandering, the devout, the forgotten. Elizabeth handled correspondence. Mary and Sarah handled the ledgers. The orders came in faster than they could fill them. So they refined the process. William experimented. He tested different methods of preservation: salt, smoke, alcohol, even crushed herbs from old European grimoires. He said the relics needed to be more lifelike, more believable, more divine. And his work paid off. One minister wrote that holding a relic from the Whitmores made him feel as if he were standing at the edge of heaven. Another claimed he heard voices when he prayed near one. Miracles multiplied. Faith exploded. Attendance soared. And with each new miracle, more churches came calling. Nathaniel started selecting targets carefully. He asked questions about local widows, orphaned children, traveling preachers with no known relatives. And when one of them disappeared, no one looked twice. The Whitmores didn't just kill, they curated. They chose victims like a sculptor chooses marble, for purity, for piety, for silence, and they sold the results as sacred truth. That's why this story never made it into textbooks. That's why your church never mentioned their... By 1758, the Whitmore operation wasn't just a business, it was a belief system. A secret doctrine passed through handshakes, letters, and sermons spoken with trembling lips. Nathaniel no longer saw himself as a craftsman. He saw himself as a prophet. He began writing essays, privately circulated among select clergy, claiming that relics made from true believers carried more than symbolic power, that they contained divine essence, residual holiness, a fragment of God's intention. He argued that the early church had it right, that the veneration of saints wasn't idolatry. It was communion, but not with spirit. With body, his words were dangerous, because they didn't contradict Scripture. They corrupted it. Ministers who had once preached against Catholic practices now praised the miraculous strength of these new relics. They told their congregations to believe, to obey, to give. The Whitmores didn't just sell to them, they fed them, and what they fed them was spiritual meat. Relics became status symbols, tokens of legitimacy, proof that your church was chosen, touched holy, and no one dared ask how they were made, because by then, the guilt wasn't just in the cellar. It was in the pulpits, in the altars, in the prayers. Everyone was complicit. Thomas wrote that by the time he was 23, he no longer felt anything. The screams had become background, the blood routine. He said his father told him, the body must die for the soul to serve. And the soul, he claimed, still served even in pieces. But it wasn't just ideology, it was economics. Churches with relics saw offerings triple, communities grew, reputations flourished, and the Whitmores became indispensable. Elizabeth managed a coded ledger, names, dates, payments, descriptions. And once a year, she burned the old one. Always, no records, no witnesses, no accountability, just faith, wrapped in velvet, sold for gold. You may think this couldn't have lasted low. Everything built on silence eventually cracks. And for the Whitmores, that crack came in the form of a man named Dr. Samuel Winters, a physician from Lancaster, curious, precise, and not afraid to question authority. He was called to examine a relic, a preserved finger bone said to belong to a 12th century martyr. The relic had reportedly healed a woman of paralysis. The local minister praised it as divine proof. But Dr. Winters saw something else. The tissue was too fresh, the preservation too crude, and most damning, the carving on the wooden case bore the unmistakable style of Nathaniel Whitmore. He asked questions, wrote letters, spoke to colleagues, and then he vanished. Disappeared while traveling to Philadelphia. With his notes, his horse was found outside an inn, saddle untouched, no sign of a struggle, just gone. A month later, that same finger bone appeared in a church in New York, labeled, sanctified, worshipped, and Dr. Winters became just another missing man in the frontier chaos. But that crack, that tiny fracture in the wall of secrecy, it grew. Because others had started to wonder. One minister refused delivery of a relic and was later found hanged in his study, declared suicide, though his pockets were filled with black velvet pouches. A Quaker woman who spoke out publicly against relic worship died of sudden illness within hours, and her home burned down 3 nights later. And through it all, the Whitmores continued. By now, the children were fully embedded. Thomas was the right hand. William was the technician. Sarah and Mary ran the ledger and letters. Elizabeth oversaw the rituals. Nathaniel dictated scripture. But something had changed. They weren't hiding anymore. Not really. They had convinced themselves it was righteous, that God had chosen them, that the screams were sacred, the dismemberment divine, the preservation holy. And once you believe that, there is no turning back. The truth is, it wasn't just a family business. It was a cult with customers, a cult that fed the American church system one body at a time. While pastors preached love over altars that concealed murder, this wasn't one family's corruption. It was institutional, and every time someone touched a relic and felt healed, they became part of it. Even now, you're beginning to understand. They erased the Whitmores, not because they were evil, but because they were too effective. And what comes next will explain why you've never heard their name. By 1782, the war was ending. The colonies were breaking from the crown. And in that chaos, the Whitmores found something new, something even more profitable, more terrifying. Children, orphaned by plague, war, famine. Children who prayed harder than grown men. Children who cried in Latin. Children who asked to be saints. And William, the quietest, the coldest, was the one who made the connection. He said, purity mattered. Said innocence had power. said the relics made from children glowed warmer, lasted longer. He said God spoke clearer, through smaller bones. The first was Joseph Miller. 10 years old, soft-voiced, led prayers at the orphanage, disappeared in February. 3 months later, a relic appeared in a small Pennsylvania church. A preserved heart, still red, still soft, sealed in glass. They said it cured epilepsy. They said it stopped a fire from consuming the bell tower. They said angels had been seen near the altar, and then they asked for more. Between 1782 and 1785, 16 children vanished from orphanages and poorhouses within 50 miles of Chester County. No one looked too hard, because the children had no one, no names that mattered, no parents to cry to newspapers, just numbers lost in silence. Sarah Whitmore wrote in her journal, the ink smeared by tears. William said the children are vessels, pure vessels, and that we are releasing their holiness. I wanted to believe him. I wanted to stop. But Father said the churches needed them, that America needed saints of her own. They began embalming entire bodies, shipping them across state lines. Churches buried them under floors, sealed them in crypts, built sanctuaries on top of them, and miracles multiplied. You prayed in those churches. You took communion in them. You brought your children there. And underneath, something watched. Something waited. The Whitmores weren't insane. They were strategic. They knew exactly what they were doing. Turning faith into currency, turning children into relics, turning murder into theology. You think evil wears horns, but it wears robes. It carries scripture. It sits at the head of the table and blesses the food. And when it's finished eating, it blesses you too. You still with me? Then keep going. It couldn't last forever. Even rot has a breaking point. And by 1790, the cracks had turned into earthquakes. It started with a letter, anonymous, sent to 6 separate churches across the eastern seaboard. Inside was a list. Names, dates, shipments, burial sites, and a final line. In God's name, burn it all. 3 weeks later, one of the churches listed in the letter caught fire. No lightning, no accident, just smoke at midnight, and then flames. It was the beginning of what would become known, quietly, as the cleansing. Over the next 5 years, 23 churches connected to Whitmore relics burned, some from arson, some from electrical failures, some from causes never explained, and in every case, the relics inside were destroyed, melted, shattered, buried under ash. This wasn't revival, it was erasure. But the Whitmores didn't panic. They went underground, literally. They expanded the cellar, dug deeper, built hidden tunnels, concealed chambers. They knew the storm was coming, and they prepared for it. Nathaniel disappeared from public life. William and Thomas took over distribution. Elizabeth went north with Sarah to New York. Mary stayed to guard the house. They split the operation, fragmented the ledger, encrypted the rituals. No more central archive, no more single point of failure. The church knew what was happening, but said nothing, because if the Whitmores were exposed, so were they. So they made a deal: keep the relics out of cities, keep the miracles small, keep the blood quiet. And in return, the Whitmores were allowed to survive, but some couldn't live with that. One young priest, Father Elijah Black, tried to reveal everything, wrote a full confession, sent it to the bishop, tried to run. He made it 40 miles before vanishing. The only thing found was his crucifix, bent backward, like something had twisted it by force. The bishop never mentioned the letter again. But we have copies, hidden in private, e-collections, whispers of truth no one wants to touch. That's why you've never read about this in your history books. That's why every mention of the Whitmores ends in a blank page, because someone burned those pages. On purpose. There are some lines even monsters won't cross. But the Whitmores, they didn't just cross them. They erased them in 1796. The tunnels beneath the Whitmore estate expanded again. Not for storage, not for worship, but for birth. They called it the breeding house. 4 rooms, stone walls, iron locks, no windows, only candlelight and scripture on every surface. It began with women, taken from brothels, from asylums, from debtors' cells. No names, no trials, just vanished. They were brought underground, drugged, purified, impregnated, some by Whitmore sons, some by priests, some, it said, by something else. The goal wasn't family, it was design. Thomas wrote in his journal, "We're not making children, we're making vessels, empty of will, full of fire." The births were ritualized, no midwives, only prayer, only blood, only silence, and the infants born there were unlike anything the family had seen. Some never cried, some stared without blinking for hours. Some spoke words they had never been taught, and some did not live long. But their remains were still used, still sanctified. But one child survived. Her name, or what we believe was her name, was Adeline. She was raised underground, educated in 4 languages, could quote scripture at 4 years old, dissect a body at 6, and by 10, she led the rituals herself. Thomas feared her. Elizabeth adored her. William called her the prophecy. She claimed visions, said the relics whispered to her, that the saints weren't dead, only dreaming, and she began writing her own gospel, page after page, in ink and blood, in languages no one recognized. What happened to Adeline is unknown, but the last written record of the Whitmores was hers. A page found years later, buried in stone, signed not with her name, but with a spiral, drawn perfectly, carved deep into the parchment, as if the ink had burned its way through. The breeding house was sealed after that, filled with stone, covered, with holy water, abandoned. But the spiral still shows up, in ruins, in drawings, in scars. It didn't end there. In the winter of 1801, something happened beneath Cedar Ridge. Something so catastrophic, so precise, that it wasn't just a cover-up. It was a purge. The official record says fire, that the Whitmore estate burned from lightning, and all within perished. But there was no storm that night, no witnesses, no survivors. What we do have are fragments, a letter from a man named Isaiah Vex, a grave digger in Lancaster, who said he was paid in silver to dig 7 graves, but only buried ash and black cloth. A note from a midwife in Chester, who said a man in robes came to her home, told her to forget the name Adeline, and then slit his own throat on her porch. And finally, the black ledger, found hidden in a sealed box beneath a New York church in 1884, pages torn, names redacted, but one phrase repeated over and over, erased by the council. That's the piece no one talks about. The council, not government, not clergy, something older, something permanent, an agreement between the church, the early American elite, and whatever power the Whitmores had unleashed, a pact, to erase them completely, not to punish, but to contain every relic destroyed, every church cleansed, every descendant sterilized, and every record removed from history. But not all of it stayed buried. The spiral kept appearing, in paintings, in dreams, in children's drawings, scrawled in blood by soldiers during the Civil War, etched into the walls of asylums, worn as tattoos by preachers who vanished. The Whitmores were gone, but their theology, their rituals, their code, survived in whispers, not as a family but as a current, flowing beneath the American religious experience, feeding miracles, feeding madness. And today, that current is rising again because you're here, listening, remembering. That means the spiral worked. That means someone, somewhere, wants this story told again. And maybe you were never supposed to hear it. But now that you have, you are part of it. And if you think this is just a story, look at your church, look at your town, look at your dreams, and ask yourself, what did they build it on? You made it to the end, but the spiral never ends. It only folds back inward, and you just stepped inside it.